Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and in this role I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. At the beginning of March this year, the Commission issued its final report to the President and Congress, outlining its recommended strategy for winning in the artificial intelligence era. This week, I spoke to Justin Lynch, Lantier and Shaantam Chawla about educating the warfighter in the AI era. They spoke about what kind of training warfighters need, from commanders to infantrymen and women, to effectively integrate AI and how that integration will change the nature of warfare and the military's perception of itself in the years ahead. I hope you find the conversation as fascinating as I did. Why don't we start by having each of you in turn, Justin, Lance, and Shaantam, introduce yourselves, and then I'll get to some questions.
Thanks, Craig. I'm Justin Lynch. I'm currently a Director of Research Analysis at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, where I work on workforce issues, so government workforce and national workforce issues. Earlier in my career, I was an active duty Army officer before transitioning to the National Guard. I was active duty infantry for 9 years, got out, went to grad school, and then became staff at the House Armed Services Committee before coming over to NSCAI.
Great. And Lance?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I am also a Director of Research Analysis on the NSCAI staff. I work primarily in the workforce side of the house, but I've also been supporting the line of effort that does responsible and ethical use of AI, as well as the efforts that we did with regard to autonomous weapon systems and AI-enabled weapon systems. I am an active duty Navy officer detailed by the Navy to the staff. In my previous jobs, I've done commanding officer of a surface warfare warship. I'm a surface warfare officer and did jobs at the Pentagon as well as the Office of Special Projects over the Navy Yard supporting acquisition.
My name is Shaantam. I'm currently an intern at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, primarily supporting the workforce team, but in the past, I've also supported the line of effort that works on prioritizing investments in AI R&D. I'm also a student at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm currently a senior studying electrical engineering and computer science and minoring in public policy.
We're going to talk about Chapter 2 of the final report, Training and Educating Warfighters. Can you start, one of you, by talking about what you mean by training and educating warfighters?
Absolutely. I'll take first shot at that before Lance or Shaantam comes in. Our idea is that for the Department of Defense, the military services, to really take advantage of artificial intelligence's capabilities, they can't just use analog processes. They can't just use analog decision-making in the same way that they have in the past and really expect it to tap into that potential. So we need our junior leaders to understand how to use and interact with AI and any other types of information processing agents, solve complex problems in combat while they plan operations and when they conduct their normal business. So the way that we've started to really think about this is AI as a decision-making factory or as a way to industrialize decision-making. So a lot of the 19th and 20th centuries was about industrializing manufacturing by regularizing and automating the manufacturing process. And that vastly increased the speed they could produce goods, the volume of goods they could produce, and the quality of a lot of the products they were making, all while reducing their costs to normal consumers and to businesses that were buying them and using them. AI offers the possibility of doing the same thing for decision making, as long as we build and effectively use the systems needed, just like we built factories and trained workers for industrializing manufacturing. And that involves a lot of things like ensuring access to appropriate computing resources, collecting and managing large volumes of relevant data, building and validating models, and creating decision aids in autonomous systems. And throughout effective organizations, identify bottlenecks in their decision-making processes, automate them as much as possible, and move humans to the boundaries of machine capabilities where they can perform a task that humans can do more effectively than machines. So organizations that integrate AI and shape their decision-making processes, like the way I just described, are going to be able to use data to make better decisions more quickly and at vastly larger scale organizations that don't. We've already seen this in e-commerce, the finance industry, advertising, and other areas. We're trying to make sure that the average warfighter understands how to work in that environment. We built a workforce model in coordination with the Defense Innovation Board and the Joint AI Center in DoD, two of the most prominent voices inside the Department of Defense for artificial intelligence. And we broke it out into a technical and non-technical workforce. So the technical being the real hands-on keyboards, people who are developing artificial intelligence solutions and all the infrastructure that I just mentioned. And non-technical being the people who are primarily experts in some sort of domain, but also need to understand enough about AI to work in the system that I just described and help build that system and make resourcing decisions, things like that. So when we say train and educate warfighters, we're talking about the military component of the non-technical workforce, senior leaders, junior leaders, and end users. Our commissioners think that there's 5 capabilities that warfighters need to have to be able to thrive. The first is to make data-informed decisions. We're contrasting data-informed decision-making with intuitive decision-making, where data-informed has a very strong empirical base. Intuitive decision-making, which is what most military leaders do now, is really based off of accumulated experience by senior leaders. And data-informed decision-making is really helpful in some areas and can help push decision-making down to a lower level and help it make it happen more quickly. Computational thinking, or the ability to break apart problems into their component pieces and use information processing agents to do a lot of the heavy lifting for some of those pieces. Human machine teaming, maker culture, where people are regularly experimenting and building things so they have a deep understanding of the technology. Then organizational transformation. How do you take an organization from wherever it is today and understanding where it is today into having AI capabilities embedded in daily operations?
When you say warfighters, are you talking about officers in the field? I mean, how far down does the training and education need to go? Does it need to go all the way to the infantry men and women? Or does it focus only on specialists within warfighting units?
We broke apart in our workforce model into the technical and non-technical fields. And so there's different training that would go to different audiences. For our non-technical fields, we think of it as senior leaders, junior leaders, and end users. And we think that those 3 categories would cover everyone in the military in uniform. So we think there's a list of generalizable tasks that are relevant to everyone.
And how should traditional warfighters interact with the technical experts that have been addressed in other chapters of the report?
I'll take that one, Justin. Craig, when we talk about traditional warfighters, we are talking about people that are traditionally very much focused on specific domains and domain expertise, on specific platforms and systems that they have a lot of training and education upon. But almost none of those today have AI in them. It's just the state of play of where we sit right now, which we talk a lot about in the report in Chapter 2. We often take people that have special skills and technical expertise, and we bend them into something like a subspecialty or give someone an additional skills qualifier, and we place this little asterisk next to them and say they are in a different bucket than the traditional warfighter in most cases. We don't typically give them the same professional credibility as a traditional warfighter, like a ship or submarine operator, a pilot, an armored vehicle driver, an artillery operator, an infantryman. And that often happens in many of the services at promotion boards as well. It's not uniformly the same across all, but in many instances, and I'll pick on the Navy where I'm from, we take those folks and if they have a subspecialty, don't prioritize their promotion based on those skills. We traditionally say you're a warfighter. Think about an integrated military workforce as we move forward that's different from that. We have to have warfighters in the workforce as well as these technical and non-technical experts in that workforce and have a way that brings them together so that the integrated military workforce not only understands how to bring those skilled personnel to bear in the warfighting domain, but also how best to leverage them to make our warfighting more lethal, more effective, faster in actual firefights, have the ability to outmaneuver our opponents in all aspects of sensor to shooter pairing in that race against time. And this includes things like cyberspace, which is not in a physical domain, but in the cyber domain. And all of that has to be driven by our top-down leadership saying this is important and driving the bottom-up innovation to take place, allowing folks to take risk and experience failure where we can, then innovate in order to rapidly learn from that and go through that cycle, just like we see in SecDevOps or software, which we don't do a lot of today. And we have to place the technical experts all the way down to the tactical edge. The question you were asking about, like, where does this need to get down to? It needs to get all the way to the tactical edge, as well as up in the higher staffs. Almost everyone in the force, and our recommendations talk to this, need to be more technically literate. They need to better understand how and when to use these technologies, the emerging and disruptive technologies, we call them, and when not to use them, like the right applications, the wrong applications for them. And there's a number of ways to do this, but one way is for Congress to require that the Department of Defense create emerging and disruptive technology critical billets that must be filled by people who actually been certified as emerging technology personnel, and then require that we place those people in those billets to serve in different positions across the force. And we talk about this in our recommendations. It'd be something akin to the way that we do joint billeting today. We don't do it for emerging disruptive technology, and we think that we have to.
And these billets would extend down to individual platoons or companies? I mean, how granular do you get?
That's a great question. That will be ideally up to the services in the Department of Defense to determine. But what you would want to see is as far down as the platoon or company level, all the way up to an operational combatant commander, major staffs, that you would have these types of billets. We talk about this in our recommendations and our blueprints about how that potentially can be done. But here's how I'll back this up. The more that you start to use AI, the more that you'll start to understand where you need to place the expertise that's critical to inform the decision makers that need it.
I understand that there are different buckets or different levels, but what is it that warfighters need to learn?
What we see as like the fundamental skills that the warfighters need to learn are everything that's needed to build AI-enabled systems, and then also use them effectively in times of need. And we break this down into 5 different categories of skills. So for each of those, I'll talk about the category, but also give a little bit of the motivation and sort of the reasoning that led to these skills being on our list of priorities. So the first comes from a need for military leaders to know exactly when to use AI, so that unnecessary time and money isn't wasted on incorrect or inefficient approaches, such as using AI when there's really no need to, or vice versa. So one way to solve this problem is by teaching problem definition and curation to leaders, so that they're able to distinguish when exactly the capabilities of AI can be useful or not, and also what their limitations are. Second comes from knowing where in a project AI fits in. This is another key piece, which can be taught as a second skill known as developing a conceptual understanding of the AI stack. So knowing the stack well means seeing how well data collection and data management and data acquisition via sensors, all these pieces involving data, fit together in creating a successful AI model. And by learning this, military leaders should be able to identify strengths and weak points of their adversary's AI as well, not just their own. The third comes from a need to adapt to the data-centric ecosystem that we live in. So this means knowing what forms data is most useful for in a model, when and why data bias can creep in and create ethical concerns, and why that's harmful as well. But then also how to secure and manage data in safe ways. And collectively, we're calling this skill data collection and management in our recommendations. The fourth one is to ensure that military leaders fully understand the outputs that their AI systems are generating. So seeing, a probability for an event or a classification for an object, typical outputs for an AI model, that's not enough to make a decision. Anyone who's commanding that system should know how confident is that system in its answer. Where could it have failed? Where could it have given the wrong answer or an incomplete answer? So we call this understanding probabilistic reasoning and data visualization. And that can help military leaders evaluate their own AI systems better. And the last one is to help military leaders use data as more of a decision-making tool, but not a crutch. So we take care to say data-informed decision-making instead of data-driven decision-making. Because in most environments, leaders will have only partial information, and they'll need to apply more critical thinking on top of whatever empirical answer they're getting from their AI models.
Do you think that most military leaders think their subordinates need to change when it comes to the application of AI?
Greg, I think most of the military leaders, if you ask them, would likely say no. There are pockets of excellence that we've seen in the past couple of years that we've engaged with across the services and at COCOMs, that understand the future of AI. They understand where the changes need to happen. But many of the folks that we have talked to and many of the folks in our own experiences that we've shared across the staff, they just believe that the service as military education and training is enough. Some will tell you that the joint professional military education that they get is enough. Some of them will tell you that the amount of training and education they get today is already too much and it's too focused on all the wrong things. I think the focus isn't there to understand what AI even is, or any of the things that we talked about these different aspects that we think that the training education needs to incorporate. And so as a whole, we're in a place where we don't even use the systems the way we should be using them because we don't understand how to best use them. And so we don't have a call for the training and education changes that need to be there. A great deal more could be achieved with the systems that we have if they were designed and developed with AI in mind from the beginning, and then with a force that was trained and educated to use them in new and innovative ways. But we don't fundamentally understand or use the myriad of sensors, nor the data that those sensors collect to our advantage today, primarily because they're not developed, designed, tested, or fielded using AI. It's just simply not out there today. And so instead, we often have folks that rely on their gut instinct or their personal experience base in their decision-making. And though we have some senior leaders that are talking today about using rigorous analytics frameworks, balancing risks and trade-offs, we don't see that that's actually taking place, especially the program decisions made at the highest levels. So when you look at how we do doctrine by its very nature is meant to instill muscle memory. It's an if-then kind of response. Input, output. I have a stimulus, I'm going to respond in a certain way, because in the heat of the battle, there's often not time to collect the data, conduct analysis, assess your course of action, and then go execute the mission. It's kind of, hey, in the heat of the moment, got to do it now, based on what I've been taught. But as AI becomes more and more ubiquitous, and as these data sets become more readily available to apply the tools against, and the infrastructure and compute becomes there in place all the way down the tactical edge to do things in real time, our mindsets have to change. Our paradigms have to shift. And therefore, our training and education that teaches us how to think about the problems, how to do the training to actually use the systems in the heat of battle has to change. The fighting force that's able to do that the most effectively is going to win decisively. You've heard our commissioners talk about it. It's in our final report. And in some cases, we're seeing that might even be able to happen with a lesser force, what we call a lesser capable force that is outnumbered, being able to outgun or outmaneuver a fighting force on the battlefield using these types of techniques.
And to one of your points, a lot of that is going to depend on trust that the AI system is providing accurate information. Do you think that these proposals will affect the way the military fights and perceives warfare?
We do, very much so. And what Lance said, he's absolutely right about the perception about the need to change. Part of the other challenge too is the idea of perceiving the need to change and then prioritizing certain types of change, and then prioritizing change over being able to meet your regular requirements already. Military leaders have more requirements than they can possibly meet, almost across the board. And so saying, okay, now we need to add something else either means you're trying to just, go to 110%, which is impossible, or you have to eliminate another requirement elsewhere. So that's a really huge challenge for military leaders. And that's true for training. That's true for personnel. A lot of people say that we need to bring in more technical experts, but bringing in those technical experts means shifting other people around or reducing forces somewhere else or increasing the overall number, none of which are hugely satisfying answers. So a lot of it's about prioritization more than anything else. To your question about how artificial intelligence will affect the way our military fights, one way to think about this is incremental change versus qualitative changes to warfare and the perception of warfare. And there's a lot of incremental change that's a fairly constant thing in the military with vehicles that can go a little bit faster, artillery that can range a little bit farther, and things like that. But qualitative change is really much more sweeping and says instead of just having that small change that is technically significant, we have changes to things like how do we use force or violence to accomplish political ends, or a change that makes expertise in a previous way of fighting less relevant. That's certainly what happened when the Germans came through with armored warfare at the beginning of World War II. the style of fighting in World War I was just suddenly much less relevant than it used to be. So we anticipate some things like that happening as artificial intelligence becomes more ubiquitous, both in our armed forces and then in our adversaries. So we talked about industrializing decision-making earlier, and that involves tapping into machine speed and scale to make many more decisions, to process much more data, and to do so much more quickly. And that's going to create those changes. So accelerating decision-making timelines is certainly the thing that people talk about the most for changing the military. There's a couple others that I'd like to highlight. The first is the increasing importance of data collection and management. We've talked about that a few times, but until we have algorithms that aren't as data thirsty as the ones we have now, organizations that can collect and manage data at scale are going to be able to perform really well. And that's not just to train better algorithms, but to actually feed their systems and stream data into them in a way that lets them make better decisions along the way. And the other part is about understanding how you can make your systems work most effectively, how you can keep your adversary systems from working more effectively, and how you can counter their attempts to do that to you as well. So understanding data collection and management and building the infrastructure for it is going to be really important. The second is the importance of peacetime surveillance. And I do mean this in a military sense. Widespread persistent surveillance is already here in many ways. And I think it's going to just become more and more of a military factor as time moves forward. There's the obvious things that people think about with cameras and things like that, the online behavior, your engagement on social media, that not just says things about you individually, about what you like online, but also helps develop things like a personality profile. Those are really significant. The third potential change is the individualization of warfare. It's increasingly easy to see individuals targeted, both with kinetic and non-kinetic effects, or with lethal and information-oriented effects. And we've seen that certainly already in the War on Terror, where there was drone strikes, but there's the possibility that with artificial intelligence and the scale that machines offer, that could actually happen with a lot more people and targeted more high-end conventional warfare as well. And that individualization can be kinetic. It also means that they can empower propaganda using some of the tools from advertising tech. And the fourth change I'll talk about very briefly is accelerating adaptation. So software kind of sits in a position where it's behavioral, affects tactics and the way they're interacting with our systems, and also is shaping our technology as well. So if you look back to previous wars or conflicts, there was a pretty long feedback loop from the field back to manufacturers, and then from manufacturers developing new technology, then pushing it forward to a combat zone. That could take quite a while for time for shipping, if nothing else. As software takes a more and more prominent role in warfare, the time for adaptation to take place is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and can happen in a more automated way. We already see this a great deal in the business world for things that require a lot of validation and verification and testing and evaluation. When that moves into combat, we think that acceleration can happen more quickly. And then the fifth is the increasing importance of system design and delegation, where right now you have many people working on one weapon system. And in the future, as swarms become more popular, as software becomes more advanced, it's more likely that we'll have a small team of people working on many systems. And that'll change the way warfighters do things, and to some extent, change how warfighters perceive themselves.
That was actually my next question. How do you think this is going to change the way the military perceives itself as warfighting becomes increasingly technical and the boots on the ground hopefully recede from contact and play more of a background role in managing systems?
I wouldn't say that anything we've talked about today so far would indicate that the boots on the ground, so to speak, would recede from combat. I think it'll change how they interact on the battlefield, but I haven't seen strong evidence that would suggest that dismounted soldiers and Marines will not be part of future combat in the same way that they have been in the past. In terms of the way this would change how the military perceives itself, there's a history of this taking place already. One of the examples we think about is how the Monitor and the Merrimack changed the way that the Navy perceived itself, where it went from this wooden hull fleet where you were very exposed to enemy gunfire, you were above water the majority of the time. So sailors in the Monitor spent the majority of their time underwater, could not see outside, had almost no exposure to the outside, and were behind armor, and their level of risk was just very different. And the types of risk that they experienced tended to be from their own machine rather than from enemy fire. It really changed the idea of what does it mean to be a sailor? You're not fighting with swords anymore. We saw some similar things when fighter aircraft changed from fly-by-wire to fly-by-computer, where suddenly it went from the pilot being in direct control of the aircraft in a very physical sense to providing instructions to a computer that then controlled the aircraft. So does that mean that a pilot's no longer really flying? It doesn't, but they had to change the way that they understood who they were and their identity. So the way that we see things moving forward is to increase the emphasis on human-machine teaming, with machines performing some of the tasks that are usually associated with human cognition, doing a lot of the heavy lifting for decision-making. So that'll change the way service members perceive their role, because there'll be less rote stuff and more creative thinking. There's going to be an emphasis on building and using systems correctly as a core skill. And so that's going to be a core part of what it means to be a soldier, sailor, airman, and marine. As machines do things that machines are really good at, humans will be able to increase their time doing things that machines are bad at. Some of that's the common sense that AI isn't very good at, but a lot of that's going to be creative problem solving and being able to see further forward, understand what they need to do, and anticipate problems that machines aren't good at anticipating. So I think creative problem solving is going to be an even larger part of the service identity than it is now. These are good changes. And they're not antithetical in any way to identifying as a warfighter who's involved in the fight. And they're very much aligned with the military's values.
I just want to add to Justin's earlier point about, boots on the ground and not seeing the wholesale replacement of types of warfare. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, they are incredibly innovative. They do things on the fly every day in the most austere conditions. And if they had the right training, the right expertise, and even some small budgets to be able to take things, even commercial off the shelf, and modify them in ways that augment the way they do business on a day-to-day basis, they can innovate on the fly using things like AI, using things like data, sensors, integration, compute to solve problems that they have every day in unique and innovative ways that they can't do today because that expertise is simply not there. And so I think what you're going to see in the short term is an augmentation in that human-machine teaming as the expertise gets the tactical edge, and a use of readily available, common off-the-shelf types of things, first and foremost, while they wait for the more extravagant solutions to arrive. They will take what they can and adapt on the fly and change the nature of warfare as we understand it right now.
How much do warfighters really need to understand about the inner workings of AI systems in order to adopt these proposals?
The warfighters who succeed at data-informed decision-making, they'll be really strong additions to their team. They can speed up decision-making processes. They can turn decision-making from purely experience-based to both experience-based and empirical-based. And what we've observed is that decision-making can happen both with or without computational thinking. So the change that we're pushing for is adding that computational thinking element, bridge the technical and the non-technical workforce. And to do this, some AI experts are going to need to be brought into warfighter roles. And conversely, some warfighters should also be made into AI experts. The vast majority need to become well-versed in AI, but not necessarily become experts. Understanding the implications of what an AI system is outputting doesn't require advanced knowledge of statistics or computer science. For example, if a military leader is looking at a classifier that's attempting to ID someone, knowing the difference between a 50% and 95% confidence level doesn't require a statistics degree. And likewise, the average warfighter won't need to know the internal details of how this classifier is working. As another example, knowledge of how to move around or manipulate data isn't necessary for most warfighters, but knowing more generally the type of data that would make a model less accurate or more accurate, that would be very useful.
When I was talking about boots on the ground, sort of pulling back from the front line, so to speak, already weapon systems have widened the gap between enemy lines, right? You no longer are fighting most of the time in close quarters because of the range of weapons systems and the ability to see what's on the battlefield. The cases in which you are in close quarters are clearing buildings or moving through an urban environment where you're fighting house to house. But if you have autonomous drones that can go into a building with a camera and identify very quickly for the warfighter where the threat exists, I'm not talking about autonomous fire capability, just situational awareness. All of those kinds of things remove the warfighter from direct contact, and I would guess that's increasingly the goal.
You're correct in saying that the changes in weapon systems over the last couple of hundred years have vastly increased the maximum distance that forces can engage each other from, where now it's global. But I don't know that I would agree that it's changed the minimum distance that the forces can engage each other from. The catchphrase is the last 100 yards. I think that that part of fighting is still incredibly relevant, and long range fires isn't going to eliminate that. That's not an uncontroversial position to take, and quite a few people disagree with that, but that's not my take on the situation. In terms of autonomous systems being able to reduce or eliminate the role of close combat, I can see it de-risking some things. Some of the drones that you're talking about that are in development or being used now can help understand where enemy forces are in a building, where people are in a building. I am not aware of a system that means that our forces don't need to go in there at all after that, or a series of drones that can clear a city. What they can do is make it safer for everyone, for non-combatants, for our forces to do so. They can help situations keep from escalating as much, all of which is good. But we still need to have our forces able to come in and either seize territory or clear it.
I worked in one of my Pentagon jobs looking at how to counter the adversary's ability to detect us, track us, target us, and potentially engage us with their weapons. To your point, Craig, when you now can leverage things like commercial off-the-shelf sensors, things like the commercially launched imagery and other types of ways of tracking assets from on high, when you're able to take that commercial world and bring that to bear as a sovereign power against the United States and hold us at risk, this means that you no longer have to wait until you're within that enemy's range to potentially be at risk of being shot at. And that is a new paradigm that we have to adjust to. When you add to that the speeds, especially when we talk about hypersonic weapons, you now take what was a somewhat slow subsonic missile speed problem and rapidly change the time from when we first detect someone shooting at us to actually detecting the missile itself to being able to respond and shoot it down and protect ourselves. And so I think we're going to see a dramatic shift in the use of artificial intelligence with existing sensors and future sensors to better protect ourselves when we are held at risk. I do not foresee a time in which, because of AI and because of autonomy and because of unmanned platforms, that we do not have our own folks at risk. In fact, because I think all nations are going to be using these more and more and more, we may potentially be at more risk in the future because these have long loiter times. They don't get tired like humans. They don't have crew rest problems where they have to be cycled in and out with a new pilot coming in. And so the dynamics of warfare is what I believe is going to change.
We were talking about the 5 areas: problem creation, data collection and management, stack, probabilistic reasoning and data visualization, and data-informed decision-making. One of the things that I think is helpful to keep in mind is we wanted to go with as generalizable a skill set as possible. And so there's 2 ways of thinking about the training. One is that there's very specific training. An Intel analyst needs to have some specific training about AI that other people on other roles don't need to have. Same with an imagery collection analyst or somebody who's working with autonomous systems. There's a very specific training that can go with that. But there's also some generalizable training as well. We went through a process with a group of subject matter experts and then our commissioners, who are also very much subject matter experts on this, to try and make sure we understood what those topics would be as best as possible and came up with those 5 topics. So when earlier you asked who would learn about these things, that's why we have such a broad audience for that. But it's certainly not the only thing that people need to learn about artificial intelligence.
To your point earlier about people already being overloaded with things that they need to learn, and combined with the question about how this will change the way the military perceives itself. We are in a transition period where warfighters are going to have to take on these new skills and let go of others. Do you have any sense of how long that transition will take?
part of what we recommended is that they be integrated into pre-commissioning requirements. There's more time available in pre-commissioning than the active duty force, which already has a very packed calendar. I don't want to downplay the requirements that are already there for pre-commissioning, but there's some flexibility. So things like statistics could be required for pre-commissioning. But also, this doesn't require mastery of these topics for the most part. It requires some good competence in those areas for a conceptual understanding, not becoming a developer yourself. Because we're talking about reading statistics versus performing statistics, so to speak, then I don't think it's as time demanding as it might seem at first glance. So we think that it's actually pretty feasible for the military to be able to integrate these into the current pre-commissioning requirements, into initial training and continuing education requirements, because it's not as huge as it might sound. In terms of the amount of time required to integrate it, it really is going to depend on some leadership decisions in the Department of Defense and in Congress and by leaders in the military services. It could go on a several-year cycle because they decide that they'll move it through a normal process, then build courses and build them all from scratch. That can take a very long time. Or they could treat it with the urgency that they treated the global war on terror in terms of trying to quickly integrate new critical lessons. And there's an existing infrastructure to do that. One thing that's really key for this is that everything that we mentioned, there's already existing training that can be found online that all DoD needs to do is establish a licensing agreement and integrate this. So the content's there. It doesn't need to be made from scratch. And if it's made a priority, if it's brought in that way rather than building it from scratch, we think it can be brought in much more quickly.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Justin, Lance, and Shaantam for their time. I encourage everyone who cares about the future of our world to read the National Security Commission on AI report, which can be found at www.nscai.gov. Regardless of how you feel about military uses of AI, I believe it's critical that people involved in the field understand what the government is doing. The singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.